welcome back to day two. So I hope you all slept well. We have another great day of panels. So I'm really excited. And by the way, I was going to say this because I didn't get a chance yesterday, but in the break, when you go out to get some fresh air, do stick your head in to the lecture theatre opposite, which is the oldest lecture theatre in the university. In the room opposite. It's really quite nice. So just be sure to stick head in. It's pretty cool. Okay, Orysia, over to you.
Good morning, everybody. It is time for panel 5, between center and periphery, Perestroika, the republics, and the national question. Our first speaker is Nataliya Kibita, talking to us about the politics of Perestroika in Ukraine. Nataliya Kibita received her PhD from the University of Geneva in 2008, and since then has taught at the universities of Glasgow, Edinburgh, and the LSE. In June 2019, after a 4-month scholarship at the Ukrainian Research Institute at Harvard University, she rejoined the Department of History at the University of Edinburgh as a visiting research fellow. Her first monograph, Soviet Economic Management under Khrushchev, the Sovnarkhoz reform, was published by Routledge in 2013. Currently, she's finishing work on her second monograph, Moscow, Kyiv, and the Ukrainian regions, the Soviet legacy in Ukraine.
Thank you.
Welcome.
Thank you. Well, first of all, thank you for the invitation, Mike. It's an amazing opportunity after 2 years of COVID, etc., etc. So, I will. That was my kind of intimate introduction. So it goes without saying that Perestroika was in turbulent times, and in Ukraine, Ukraine saw growth of national democratic and ecological movement. This is what I will not talk about. What I will talk about today is not the ideological shifts in Ukraine, but what Perestroika revealed about the Communist Party of Ukraine. Why? Because, as you know, the political elites remained in place. There was very strong institutional inertia after 1991. So, a nice look at the party in the last years of Perestroika is needed. So when Gorbachev launched Perestroika, the Ukrainian Communist Party projected an image of a homogeneous mass party functionaries divided into various level territorial party organizations, mainly Obkomy being the largest units, with the first party secretary at its head. To many, he was known as a strong leader. Newsweek in May 1987 called him the Politburo's untouchable. However, such image of the CPU could not be further from reality. The CPU was fragmented, and Shcherbitsky did have a posture of a strong authoritarian leader. However, the institute of the first party secretary was weak. The Obkomy did not have horizontal relations. They directly communicated with Moscow, ЦК in Moscow. Each oblast was effectively run by a party-state coalition, not clans. We can talk about clans in Dnipropetrovsk or Donetsk, but certainly not in Chernihiv. Nonetheless, there were party-state coalitions in all oblasti. And these coalitions included the highest authorities and directors of the largest enterprises, with the Obkomy secretaries on the top. The Obkomy had a degree of autonomy from the Central Committee in Kiev and were focused on socio-economic agenda. And to fulfill their agenda, they often relied on local managers, who in their majority were subordinated to the Moscow-based industrial ministries. So, transformation of economy and politics initiated by Gorbachev in Moscow placed the regional party apparatus, and I'll call them the regions from now on, in a dire need of a consolidated center in Ukraine for Ukraine. The Ukrainian leadership was not against the idea. The disagreement between the Ukrainian leadership and the regions was about how should the Ukrainian central administration be consolidated. So the Ukrainian leadership believed that the authority of the Ukrainian leadership should be expanded from Moscow, so granted. The regions believed that the Ukrainian leadership should be based or опираться on the regions. It should represent the regions. So demand for a strong center. So this is the building of the parliament, of the Ukrainian parliament. The demand for a strong center in Ukraine for the regions was based on several factors. So one factor was weakening of the regulatory role of Moscow, yet at the same time, the reluctance of the Moscow-based industrial apparatus to release control over economy. The second reason was a shift in priorities of the regional authorities. Until 1988-89, the territorial party organizations had basically two main tasks to fulfill. One was to fulfill the plans, another one to ensure that their territories developed, so the socioeconomic development. And for both tasks, they relied on local managers. The contested elections, here were Kravchuk voted contested elections to the Verkhovna Rada. The contested elections to local Soviets and party organs that Gorbachev introduced in 1988-89 transformed socioeconomic development of the oblasti, which was the second task for the Obkomy, from administrative into political, first of all, and hence it shifted the priority for elections, shifted the priority for the Obkomy. So now fulfilling central plans was secondary to meeting social agenda. This was acknowledged by the Central Committee in Moscow. There was a resolution in August 1989, if I'm not mistaken, that acknowledged it. And the third issue that made the regions demand that Ukraine installed a strong center, the Ukrainian leadership installed a strong center in Kiev, was the shift of power centers from in the periphery, from the Obkomy into the Rada of Soviets. The Obkomy secretaries had to be elected. They wanted to be elected into the Soviets. Hence, we come back to the socioeconomic local agenda. So to stay in power in the forthcoming elections of 89 and the 90, regional party secretaries needed an authority that would help them address socioeconomic problems in their territories that included consumer goods, food, but also jobs, and jobs meaning inputs for the enterprises. And glasnost pushed them to think slightly outside their own personal gains. So with Moscow demonstrating reluctance to lead the party, you probably, I shouldn't, if necessary, I'll evolve this point in the Q&A, and the inability to secure inputs and supplies to enterprises, the regions urged the Central Committee and, not yet. The regions urged the Central Committee in Kiev and personally Sherbitsky to assert Kiev's authority over the party and the state system within Ukraine. But assert the authority of Kiev not by centralizing control over Ukraine or of economy, but by introducing changes to the system. And in particular, at the end of 88, they were asking Sherbitsky to decentralize economic administration in Ukraine. More specifically, they insisted that Kiev regulated and formalized the relationship between local Soviets, local producers, and the ministries, again, to enable them target the shortage of consumer goods and food, etc., and secure jobs. They also insisted that the Ukrainian leadership devised a clear formal distribution of the profits of enterprises between enterprises, local budgets, and the ministries. They asked for a transparent system of centralized food distribution, so Kiev controlled food distribution between the oblasti. They asked for a transparent system of distribution of funded materials that Moscow allocated to Ukraine, and share of these materials Kiev could distribute among the regions. They wanted the Ukrainian leadership to force the ministries to respect the law of state enterprises and not extract sometimes 90% of profits that enterprises could make. Some of Home secretaries insisted that the Ukrainian leadership finally liberated them from dependence on local managers and aligned their responsibilities for the socioeconomic agenda with the rights and financial means. On the political front, with glasnost changing public environment to less hospitable for communists, the obkom required guidance from the party leadership as to how to win elections. And they did not care whether the guidance would come from Moscow or Kiev. However, they urged the Central Committee in Kiev to formally decentralize the administration of the party. So each obkom, they asked, should be free to lead political struggle as it thought was necessary for its territory, depending on the local conditions. The regions understood very well that Kiev was not empowered to solve many of their problems. They knew the power center was in Moscow, but they urged the Ukrainian leadership to rethink its function of the main intermediary agency as it was since 1920s between the periphery and the central agencies. Instead of focusing on assisting the ministries in extracting resources from the regions, or sort of transmitting the message from Moscow to the regions, or sending down the directives and instructions, the region suggested that the Ukrainian leadership focused on assisting the regions with the implementation of economic reforms, with meeting socioeconomic needs of the population, and with confronting growing political opposition. So instead of acting on the behalf of Moscow, the regions urged the Ukrainian leadership to accept the increasing importance of addressing the regional problems before branch interests, to act on behalf of the regions. In other words, the region suggested to the Ukrainian leadership to consolidate itself from below. Partly under the pressure from the regions, partly because Gorbachev provided such an opportunity, calling a plenum on discussing межнациональные отношения. But Sherbitsky wrote a letter on the 31st of December. He wrote a letter to the Central Committee in Moscow and submitted the suggestions of the ЦК КПУ on perfection of international relations in the USSR. And here I want to remind you that Sherbitsky was, to put it shortly, very much Moscow's man in Ukraine. He was as pro-Russian, as pro-Moscow, as pro-Union as one could imagine. And in the letter, in following 13 or so pages, Sherbitsky, in a fundamental departure from his previous stance towards the old Union Center, he diplomatically, yet insistently and in very detail, explained to Gorbachev why Moscow should revive and I quote, the main Leninist principles of construction of the Soviet federative state. That Moscow should formalize the relationship between the center and the republics and expand republican rights. To quote a few points from his letter, Sherbitsky suggested that there was a place for the republics to participate in the foreign policy, informing foreign policy of the Soviet Union. And there was a place for the republics in foreign trade to participate directly in the foreign trade. Sherbitsky wanted a, and I quote, qualitatively new mechanism for the formation of republican and local budgets. Republican budget should be predictable, and the republic should have full control of it. More importantly, in the departure of the Soviet tradition, the budget should be formed bottom up. The republic, not the union, should collect all taxes paid by the population organizations, cooperatives, and enterprises, and accord regardless their departmental subordination. And it is for the republic to pay a tax to the old union budget I quote, for all common union tasks, based on a stable normative. Union should stop allocating funds to the republics based on Moscow's whim. Shcherbetsky also expected, and I quote, mutually beneficial trade between the republics based on formal contractual obligations. In the conclusion, Shcherbetsky on the economic part, Shcherbetsky said that it was impossible to accomplish fundamental success in socioeconomic development without considerable expansion of the powers of the Republican administrations. And such expansion should include Ukraine's access to information. The Ukrainian leadership should have direct access to raw statistical data and not receive information on Ukraine after the center processed it. In absolutely drastic departure from his past convictions, Shcherbetsky indicated to Gorbachev that he could no longer support Russification in Ukraine, and not because of suddenly found love for Ukrainians, for the Ukrainian language or culture, or support for the national question in its traditional Soviet interpretation, but because of pragmatic factor of elections. He reasoned that without making concessions to Ukrainians, the communists would not win in the regions. The document that Shcherbetsky sent to Moscow showed two things. One, that he was all in favor of consolidating the Ukrainian center, but only if Moscow allowed it. And two, Shcherbetsky did not favor devolution of economic authority below the level of Kiev. Needless to say, Gorbachev and the Central Committee in Moscow did not act on Shcherbetsky progressive ideas. And without Moscow's sanctions, Shcherbetsky would not proceed. Well, he would not proceed, but the problems for the regions in Ukraine, they remained in place. They remained under systemic pressure. So they continued putting pressure on Shcherbetsky in '89. In June and August, some insisted, I here put to, so First Party Secretary Georgy Kryuchkov moved to Odessa in '88 from CK KPSS, from Moscow, to say, and then we have, thank you, sorry. And then Pogrebnyak, he moved from the apparat of CK KPU to Lviv, two completely different regions. I'll just give you Pogrebnyak's quote. In June 1989, at a meeting in the CK KPU, he says, in order to provide rational administration of economy, it is necessary to accelerate the establishment of new economic relations between the center, the republic, and the oblasti. The regions insisted it is for the sake of your survival, so the survival of the Communist Party, we need to decentralize. Shcherbetsky wasn't prepared for that. He resigned in September '89. And frankly, 5 minutes is plenty, because what happened in 1990 and 1991, more of the same. The new secretary, Ivashka, he very much was in favor of obtaining power from Moscow. He was not prepared to delegate power to the regions. And in January 1990, Gorkom secretary Vlasenko from the Sevastopol, Gorkom, he said at a meeting, you will never restore order from the center top down. The regions did not object to the diktat per se, no. They were against the diktat that did not provide them with political security and consumer goods for the population and inputs for enterprises. They also suggested that the CK KPU should draft policies in cooperation with the regions, because without the input of the regions, there was no security that these resolutions and policies will be implemented. They insisted that the party should be decentralized, repeated again the same points, that they should be able to autonomously address the political agenda in their regions. And the regions no longer agreed to be solely responsible for the political situation and the economic crisis. They insisted that the relationship between the CK KPU and the Obkomich was formalized, and the rights and the responsibilities were correlated. By June 1990s, they increased pressure on Kiev. They absolutely insisted that Kiev proceeded with economic reforms towards market economy. They insisted that Kiev created a system that would secure the fulfillment of contracts for which all, regardless of ideological convictions, authorities were insisted. And again, they reminded Kiev that it should install transparent system, fair, transparent system of distribution of funds that Kiev controlled. In June 1990, Ivashka came to the same conclusion as Sherbitsky. The relationship between Moscow and Kiev should be formalized. As Sherbitsky, he was not prepared to devolve power lower Kiev. Why? He still expected that Ryzhkov's program would provide Kiev with authority. All these hopes were shattered after, in fact, in September 1990, when Yavlinsky's team offered the so-called 15-day program of transition to the market. What the Ukrainian CK saw is that there would be no devolution of power from Moscow to Kiev. They saw the same centralized control over economy as there was before. There was no formalization of the relationship, hence there was no increased authority of the Ukrainian leadership granted by Moscow. The obvious unwillingness of the Ukrainian, and of course there was declaration of sovereignty in June by Russia, July by Ukraine. So the obvious unwillingness of the Union Center to share power motivated the Ukrainian government to take a more assertive control over the Ukrainian economy. And I'm finishing quite literally. And yet still it refused to delegate power to the regions. And in autumn 1990, the Obkom secretaries and the communist MPs from the Verkhovna Rada, the majority, again urged the government to switch the entire approach to stabilization of Ukrainian economy from top down to bottom up, to decentralize state administration and formally empower local authorities and enable them address local economic issues. Under pressure from the regions, yet again, in April 91, the new Prime Minister, Witold Fokin, he promised to the regions that there would be no replacement, this Kravchuk and Fokin, that there would be no replacement, and I quote, of the diktat of Moscow with diktat of Kiev. The promise Kiev could not hold, as time showed, and was unwilling to hold. The end result of the struggle between the vision of the regions as to how Ukraine should be run and the vision of the Ukrainian leadership was persistent weakness of the central leadership in Ukraine, which after 1991 would be called the Ukrainian executive branch, and the persistent fragmentation of the Communist Party, which transformed into regionalism. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Nataliya, for that excellent paper. Our next speaker is Riccardo Cucciolla, delivering remarks on the Turkmen front, rethinking the 1989 inter-ethnic clashes in Ashgabat and Nebit-Dag. Riccardo Mario Cucciolla obtained a PhD in political history at IMT Lucca, a co-tutel degree with the Higher School of Economics in Moscow, with a dissertation titled The Crisis of Soviet Power in Central Asia, the Uzbek Cotton Affair, 1975 to 1991. He has conducted research in Russia, Uzbekistan, and Denmark. He was a postdoctoral fellow at the Higher School of Economics between 2017 and 2019, and then at the Università Roma III between 2019 and 2020, and at LUISS Guido Carli in Rome between 2020 and 2021. Currently, he is an assistant professor at the history of Russia and Eastern Europe at the University of Naples, the Oriental. Welcome.
Thank you. Thank you, everybody. And thank you, Michael Loader, for making possible an event like this after 2 years being back to normality and to see all the new friends all together. I mean, it's an impressive result. I'm very happy to be with you today and to test this paper, which is something new also for me on a republic that we usually do not discuss that much, which is Turkmenistan. And I'm very happy to do it together with you. What is the matter of Turkmenistan? I was interested in a fact. I mean, the Soviet collapse has been generally been interpreted as a peaceful event. We have anyway some cases of violence, of interethnic clashes in Fergana in 1989, in Osh in 1990, in Dushanbe. For sure, we have the conflict in Nagorno-Karabakh. And then we have some literature which is reporting, I would say, a quite mysterious case in Turkmenistan happening in the May Day in Ashgabat and during the Victory Day in Nebit-Dag, the city which is now called Balkanabad. I was always thrilled by the idea of studying maybe the closest, the most peripheral, and probably the most mysterious republic of the USSR, which even became one of the most repressive regimes in the world. And in the previous years, I had the occasion, when I was in Moscow, I had the occasion to search for material on Turkmenistan and to try to argue a story that has been maybe unintentionally underrated. However, these two smaller cases became a turning point for what? For repressing the opposition and for strengthening Niazov regime. So my hypothesis is that relevant or not, big or not, this episode explained why there was basically no perestroika in Turkmenistan. Let's go to the event. So the Turkmen capital Ashgabat was ready to celebrate the Labor Day. However, yet the economic crisis, the rising prices, and the increased unavailability of basic necessity converged the anger of several students against Armenians, a minority that was already involved in a war against a broader people, and that was now accused of speculation for the alleging increasing bread prices during the period of food shortages. So on May 1, 1989, mass disturbances began in Ashgabat, accompanied by pogroms, destruction, arsons, and violent actions. The riots were initiated by anti-Armenian individuals in the Central Park of Culture and Recreation in Ashgabat. The crowd gathered there began to resent the high prices in the cooperative stalls and buildings where Armenians were selling and working. And then this resulted in the destruction of a cafe, of a bar, of a great cafe, of a video salon, of a children games pavilion, a restaurant, a philharmonic hall, and other facilities. The police failed to localize the rioting. The raging crowd headed towards the center, blocked transport, smashed trolley buses, and beat up Armenians who got caught. So pavilions and kiosks in the marketplace were destroyed. Armenians were beaten, their cars and houses were damaged. The damage amounted to some 105,000 rubles, while 115 persons were arrested. The violence against Armenians spread also in other cities. So on May 9, 1989, during the mass festivities dedicated to the Victory Day in the central square of Nebit-Dag, some 200-300 people started to shout down with Armenians, down with their cooperatives. The police tried to calm the crowd. Shouts broke out then and turned against the police, so beat the cops, burned the cooperatives. And so also in Nebit-Dag, 19 policemen were injured, 29 properties, mainly cooperatives of Armenians, were burned down, and some 47 people were detained. Among them were those who even took part in the pogroms against Armenians in Ashgabat. And what is surprising of this event is that this is the best we know of this episode. And this was reported in a book in 2005 by Victor Union. There are several books that report these episodes in the max that dedicate them 2-4 lines. Even the newspapers are not that accurate at the time, and the media generally minimized what happened, speaking about some hooligans breaking windows, some dozen drunk who had been stopped. But this is the best that has been published at the time. Was this an important case? Was this relevant to the development of the Niazov regime? Anyway, historians need primary sources, and again, where can we get? If we are lucky, we can get access to the Central State Archive of Turkmenistan in Ashgabat, but this is not the real possibility. Turkmenistan historiography is still a regime matter, and archives are generally closed, especially to foreign citizens. So the best that we can get is a state level, but we know the difficulties of reaching this kind of information. So where can we get the party stuff? And again, Moscow is helping us in the Fund 17 of Gaspi. This is where I was finding these protocols of the Turkmen party in terms of Congress, in terms of Plena, in terms of Bureau, and in terms also of very interesting act. So here we might say on May 3, an emergency session of the Turkmen Politburo was discussing the Ashgabat facts. Here, the first secretary of Turkmenistan, Sapar Murat Niyazov, the future Turkmen Bashi, was identifying this group of hooligans, young people, and mentioned that unlawful actions caused material damage of about 60,000 rubles, bodies of internal affairs detains more than 50 people, about half of them students of school and vocational school. Here I'm just citing. What happened was the result of the weakening of educational work with young people by party and consumer organization, serious omissions in the activities of Soviet law enforcement and economic bodies, teaching staff of educational institutions, institutional and organizations of culture, sports, trade, and mass media. The party is shocked by what? By the spontaneous fire, and basically blames a series of city cadres for lack of organization of entertainment. Was also blaming the speculators selling alcohol and even the police officer that did not show promptness and abilities to act in a difficult situation. On May 3, also the Ashgabat.com discussed the incident and detailed those facts, referring that those who took part in the outrages were mostly teenagers aged between 9 to 16 years old. The majority of the 107 detained people live, study, and work in the Sovietsky Rayon, in the very center of Ashgabat. Over 40 people are students of school 5, 8, 9, 23, 24, 35, vocational school number 4, 7, 16, 18, whatever, and made a longer and detailed list of organs that did not act properly. So this appeared to be a prelude to purges which actually took place. There is something else that we can look at. Despite the non-organized nature of the events, the spontaneous fire, the party could now take the occasion to aim and blame some specific targets. A few days later, the Charju of Bureau listed the tense situation in some very local dimension and referred to Recent events in Tbilisi and in a number of other regions of the country show that there are individuals and sometimes group of people who seek to use democratization and the expansion of glasnost to preach permissiveness, lawlessness, ignoring the constitutional provisions on the obligation of a citizen before the society and law. Nationalist speeches are increasingly acquiring an anti-socialist and anti-Soviet character. These speeches have led, in some cases, to tragic consequences, cause human casualties, difficult to compensate material and moral damage. Individuals dissatisfied with Perestroika changes in society, as well as criminal elements, undertake actions aimed at destabilizing the situation, pushing the immature youth to riot, to anarchic speeches. An example of this, the speeches of young people, their senseless vandalism in Ashgabat and Nebit-Dag on May 1 and May 9. So who was the first aim of them? Evidently, the Ashgabat and the Nebit-Dag episodes gave the opportunity to Niyazov and to Turkmen authorities to operate against those oppositions now accused of nationalism. But who were they? There were several small and weak initiatives. Turkmenistan is already a small republic, and also the opposition that was just rising up were small, very small initiatives. But they tried to play a very limited role in the transition, but they had been immediately repressed. The first organizations and manifestations appeared in relation to the veteran of the Afghan war. Others were related to the initiatives to rename the streets and school with local names. Other around journalists such as writers, journalists and dissidents. One of them was Akmurat Betsapar, a guy who was writing about child mortality, large-scale famine in the country, injustice in rural areas, and environmental problems in Turkmenistan. There were even those initiatives related to the desovietized interpretation of history. That was another very important element in this alternative discourses in Turkmenistan in 1989, for example, about the demanding a memorial on the Göktepe, one of the main battles on which the Turkmenia lose its independence. And for sure, there were all the initiatives related to languages, as the writer and journalist Kulick Carli. Many of these critical intellectuals formed this, I would say, this umbrella organization, which was very small at the end, Akziberlik, the Unity of Voice. It was founded in Ashgabat in 1989, and their goal was described as a formation of a multi-party democratic system. They addressed several cultural demands, including raising the status of the Turkmen language, rehabilitating the victims of Stalinist terror, reviewing Soviet teaching on the incorporation of Turkmenistan into the Russian Empire. So again, the reassessment of the Göktepe battle, reducing the number of Russian toponyms in the Turkmen SSR, and again, ecological and colonial issues related to cotton and the full control of water and natural resources. But anyway, Akziberlik was very small. They even failed to recruit the 1,000 members needed for registration. So it was even a not registered organization. It was, in fact, an elite discussion club. Anyway, Niyazov was formally a supporter of Perestroika, but at the same time, he was slowing down the reforms promoted from Moscow, and he perceived Akziberlik as a threat. And this clearly emerged when he devoted a significant portion of his speech to the Republic Conference of Mass Media on the 28th of April of 1989 to attack Akziberlik, accusing, so 3 days before the incidents in Ashgabat, to attack Akziberlik of accusing them of being an enemy of Perestroika, of pandering to fashion by simply copying its program from a Baltic nationalist group. According to Niyazov, those debates had to be discussed within the party. So this is a clear negation of the civil society, and there is no negotiation with them. Here we have some participants of Akziberlik in the studio of the sculptor Mohammad Said Muratov. in the center, the journalist and writer Carli that we mentioned before. Kulick was banned in January 1990. The members founded a second group called Party for Democratic Development that was expressing concern about the authoritarian rule of Niazov, but also this formation was banned in a matter of months. Part of the group then moved already at the end of 1990 to Moscow. They started to publish a newspaper called Dainach, Support. Others went to Georgia, others to Turkey, others to the US, just a few states. This just to give the dimension of the phenomenon. Here the activist Nurmagomedov on the stage during a protest against the GKCHP in August 1991 in Ashgabat. See that? Yeah. When a group of people who sought to celebrate the defeat of August coup in mid-September, they were all arrested, all the remaining members of Kulick. During the course of 1992-1993, the authorities also sought to limit the ability of those dissidents to meet with foreign delegations, especially in 1992 when James Bagger visited Ashgabat, and the writer Ben Sapar was effectively placed under house arrest. Also, other activists were advised to stay at home. And so what is the connection between these two stories? Jacob Roy believes that these episodes may have been manipulated by the KGB in order to convince the Central Asian leadership to preserve their ties to Moscow. Here, the chairman of the Turkmen KGB, the Major General Pyotr Arkhipov, on the left. What is interesting about the role of KGB is emerging in an article that is published in the KGB Sbornik of November 1990. And this is entitled The Turkmen Phenomenon. And this report says that Niazov invested all in a conflict prevention, as it emerged, as it was recalled even at the 28th Congress, and in order to do not repeat the actions prepared by those that in May 1989 did not accept Perestroika, including Kulick, and some elements that copied the program of the Poles. So they attempted to create a people front in the city of Charles did not succeed. And by April 1990, the Kulick activities were virtually paralyzed by the prompt action of the KGB. So the effort of preventive repressions actually succeeded in Turkmenistan. The Ashgabat and Nebit-Dag event linked limited participation of civil society and the strengthening of one of the most authoritarian and personalistic regimes. In the meantime, Niazov subsequently appropriated much of the Kulick program, as it happened with many other regimes and opposition. Most notably, even Niazov promoted the adoption of a law on language on May 1990, which declared Turkmen as the official state language, or the transliteration from Cyrillic to Latin that occurred in 1993. Niazov even reconsidered the incorporation of Turkmenistan into the Russian Empire by acknowledging the defeat of the Georg-Tepe in 1881 as a national tragedy. So it was appropriating much of the opposition agenda, and he recovered the narrative over the mythological origins of the Turkmen and the rehabilitation of Stalin victims. However, this was a process from above. In Turkmenistan, the Perestroika openness basically lasted for less than 1 year, from 1990 to February 1991, when censorship was even reintroduced in Turkmenistan. And besides harassing the opposition in autumn 1991, the official position of the regime was reintroduced to consolidate Niazov regime and to prevent him from attacks or even preventing fundamentalist or Islamic revival as a political threat. This meant basically revitalizing Islamic institutions. Some 100 mosques reopened in 1991, 1992. In 1986, there were just 4 in the World Republic. But bring them under firm state control. So Perestroika intentions and openness had been rapidly liquidated in one of the most authoritarian regimes in the world. And this happened according to what we read, just exploiting this spontaneous fire in Ashgabat and Nebit-Dag. Thank you.
Sorry.
It's okay. No, I'll just go
Oh,
around.
that's okay. It's fine.
Um,
Also stay here if you want later.
Later. It shines in my face. Our final speaker is Carolina De Stefano, talking to us today about debating the national question at the RSFSR Congress of People's Deputies, majority-minority relations from the Soviet Union to Russia, 1990 to 1993. Carolina De Stefano is a researcher and adjunct professor in Russian history and politics at Luis Guido Carli University in Rome, and an associate researcher at the Center for Russian, Caucasian, and Central European Studies at EAGSS in Paris. She has published on nationalities, politics during Perestroika in the Russian Review in 2020, and the Journal of Eurasian Studies in 2022, and the Journal of Eurasian Studies in 2020. An article reassessing the 1989 Central Committee Plenum on Nationalities is under review with Kahir Dumont-Bruce, and she's also working on a monograph based on her dissertation on Moscow's management of the national question under Gorbachev and Yeltsin. Welcome.
Thank you very much. Thank you. So in this panel, I'm having a total different approach from the one that was preceded and by Nataliya and Riccardo, because I'm looking at Moscow's approach towards all these issues during Perestroika. And before I get to the point, the presentation on the Russian Congress, I mean, the Russian Congress and discussions in the Russian Congress are just the last step of a broader research I'm doing, trying to reviewing in some way, it's not so easy, Soviet nationality policy during Perestroika. Because Gorbachev's nationality policies are primarily and almost exclusively viewed as the failure of the Union Center to deal with national issues. And in the 3 articles I wrote, I follow in quite a chronological order some key events of Soviet nationality policies, trying to show that there were also novelties which are key to follow a transition from the Soviet Union to Russia in terms of management, and especially from an institutional perspective. And I think that one way to do this is to separate 2 parallel levels, which is the political level of crisis management. And so something that it's clearly a failure of the Soviet leadership to deal with this issue and not managing to find a political agreement, also in the context of the Union Treaty negotiation, but a very interesting parallel process made of experts and real efforts, daily efforts for 3 years to review and find solutions that had an impact on later Russian nationality policies, both for novelties, but also for continuities. In other way, I'm trying to look at this transition period as a needed link between the imperial and Soviet period and the Russian nation state. One, also try to explain why our continuity is still there and not just taking it for granted, saying that Russia didn't reform at all. So the general idea, and to go more into the detail, in the 1989 plenum, for example, there were, in this latest document that was approved, that is just described in the literature as the proof that it didn't work, some interesting points in terms of creation of new bodies on nationalities. I was reading yesterday some pages of the book by Salius that was also saying how there was not a department on nationalities during the Soviet Union. And it is in this period, in the context of these reforms, that the idea that a department that then will become the Russian Ministry for Nationalities is needed, because it's not so only needed to deal with single republics, as it was dealt by the party, the Central Committee, but also it's needed to have, or to try to have, a continuous central approach, trying to elaborate something that is also common and different depending on cases. And then I looked at the USSR Congress of Deputies debate, looking at how, not the only debate, but also the structure of the parliament, and at how there was a proliferation of a lot of bodies on nationalities that was created ad hoc in this period. Committees for the rehabilitation of the population, a committee on nationalities that was trying to elaborate a new approach, and how this was a clear active response from the centers, not just the reactions to pressures, also as part of the democratization process, as the belief that these committees and these bodies of discussion would have managed also to dilute conflicts. And finally, in the article that was published on the Russian Review last month, I tried to systematize the different phases of nationality policies by looking also in the context of the Union Treaty negotiation, how even the practices and the involvement of experts, this is something more difficult to prove, had an impact on Russian nationality policies, because you have some key figures that were actively involved. Of course, there were anthropologues and ethnographs that were working on potential reforms of nationalities in the earliest period, not only during the Perestroika, but the fact that the first time they were called to deal with the crisis of nationalities made them a specific figure of experts of nationalities, and that were called to deal or to try to deal, for example, with Chechnya in the early 90s. I'm thinking about Mikhailov, for example, Vyacheslav, who was the first and last head of the Department of Nationalities. I interviewed him several times in Moscow, and then he became not only one of the Ministry of Nationalities in the mid-90s, but also one of these guys that in the early 90s were sent to discuss and negotiate in Nagorno-Karabakh, in Abkhazia, and in Chechnya, without really making a difference. And this is also interesting, between the foreign policy and the fact that these unresolved conflicts were now out of the borders, and domestic issues. And now I'm at the early stages of this chapter. I'm writing in the framework of the project that I started with, I worked on of Jeremy Smith and Alexander Semyonov, on the position of majority-minority relations in the transition from imperial entities and state polities and a nation state one. And one of the key issues that is quite new in this period is rightly the question of the protection of minorities. In all the articles I wrote, this issue of protecting minorities, which is quite new. I mean, there was the protection, and there were the rights of the Narodov that had to be guaranteed also in the Soviet architecture. But this idea of protecting the minorities is really something new and rapidly shifting also within the Russian Congress. And there are some reasons why. Of course, the first one is that it's a new challenge already in the USSR context, but also within Russia, because with the nationalizing discourse, you have a lot of groups that feel less protected, but are less protected. And also there is a political interest, this is quite clear, especially in the USSR leadership, in pushing forward the idea of protecting minorities in the name of the unity of the country. So we have to protect all this population that are threatened by nationalizing discourses and the republics in the name of the Druzhba Darov. There is something really classic, but there is also an interest in then pushing for the adoption of a legislation on the protection of minorities in this sense. And in the RSFSR context is a bit even different. I could observe this before and on the material on the Congress, on the material of the new Committee on Nationalities that was created, that is to protect minorities and groups that are threatened in the different regions of Russia and also in the USSR, because they might migrate to Russia. And in these early months of the 90s, there is the fear that there could be a massive migration towards Russia. So they're also interested in protecting minorities in a sense of making sure that these people are not moving towards Russia, towards Moscow in a moment of tension and an economic crisis, and then they will be protected by staying where they are. So it's not a protection to the point of attracting them to Russia. And one concept that we try to analyze in detail in this project we have with Jeremy and Sasha in this book that will be the result of the project is to see how the very concept of minority is discussed at the constitutional and parliamentary level within the Russian Congress. And we can see some interesting trend. As I said, it's the beginning of my readings of all the documents I collected at GARF, mainly at the Lenin Library, but how there is a clear shift of the use of the word minority, menshinstva, which was not really popular during the Soviet Union, but that was quite popular in the previous era of transition, of revolutionary transition. It's a concept that he used even in the early Bolshevik period, with references to the big minority group, and more in the Western sense, like the Polish population was using them, and was used by the opposition movements between 1905-7 and 1918. Then you have almost a disappearance in the context of the Soviet Union of this very word that is sometimes used. There are some documents in which he used, but it's not in the language of the Soviet Union. And then you have the reappearance of this word. But what is interesting is that it's not used in the discussions, because the discourse is really quite similar to the past, but it's pushed forward by experts also in trying to affirm a conception of minority that was more in line with the international context. These are also years in which there is an influence of the international framework, in which even the USSR is signing some documents on the protection of minority, at least indirectly. And what you see is that if you look at the documents or different projects on the law on the protection on on minorities, you see this clear shift rightly before, all in the period within the Congress, but before the end of the Soviet Union. You have a first draft, which still has a definition of minorities, which is quite typical, and the definition was related only to population that didn't have that were either outside their territory of belonging, or they didn't have any. While the concept of minorities, the other sense is, I mean, in the draft of 1991, November, 1 month before the end of the Soviet Union, is a much broader idea of minorities as every group that might be discriminated in contrast with the major population. So there is this attempt at changing the minority majority even definition in the language, even though I have to say that now we know the latest story is that in 1998 all these projects were not be approved. The law of minorities does not exist in Russia, but still this conception and this minority issue was quite critical in that moment, and is superposed, and this is the other part that I have to study, with this idea of this concept of malachisteny narody, and there was this superposition between these two definition. So I think I And I don't know how many minutes I have, but okay, so it was very short.
That's okay. We'll have more time for questions.
Yes, let's do this.
Great.
Thank you very much.
I would like to welcome the other panelists back for the Q&A. Actually,
45 minutes.
okay, so we're just going to. I'm not sure if I asked for now. So we'll take a series of questions, 2 or 3, Ron, please. Go ahead.
So my question is to Roberto, Riccardo, sorry. Why Armenians? Now, so it seems to me, and I've always sort of emphasized this in my own writing, that you can't really talk about ethnicity without considering what we used to call class. That is, where are these people located in the social structure? And what roles are they playing that create resentments of some kind? That these people are getting privileges and status that they don't deserve, but that we locals deserve. And resentment is a very powerful emotion in dealing with groups and the way they're constructing a sense of existential danger from somewhere else. So I'd love to hear that discussed. And for Carolina, in the Perestroika period, as you're loosening the hand of coercion and allowing democracy, and this suddenly explodes into these interethnic conflicts, what's the role of influence here? Where does the arrow of determination go? From the events that are occurring that suddenly spark interest? Or is it that they loosened up things and then the conflicts occur, or simultaneously? Is there a way of determining why suddenly this question became so important when it had been sort of neglected for so long?
I have a question for Carolina, which could also possibly lead into Nataliya's topic as well, which is about the issue of minorities, but also about the issue of Soviet governance in general and its sort of perestroika era crisis. In the Caucasus, obviously, minority issues is always there. It's never gone away. And there are sort of various cycles of trying to deal with the issue, including in the 20s, a sort of experiments with autonomous glass and Soviets, dealing with very small minorities indeed in some cases. So my question is this, and it possibly has traction to Ukraine as well. What degree do you see with these experts that you're talking about an attempt to fit this new language into the old structures? Are they trying to revive genuinely Soviets and autonomous glass and the structural strengths, which were always very weakly legally embedded in the Soviet system? Or is there a genuine effort to find some new balance and some new system?
I'll let you answer those questions. I'll let you someone else. You guys.
Okay, so why Armenians? This is a very interesting point. Actually,
Such nice people, you know.
Actually, I mean, compared to the Turkmen population, also the Armenian minority was not that small. I mean, it was a matter of some 15,000 people for a republic which had a little more than 1 million. So they were mainly concentrated in cities. They were traders. They were selling things, and the resentment was for this accuse of speculation on bread prices in this moment of food shortages. The question is important as far as was not finding anything about these Armenians, how these Armenians were perceiving such resentment, especially because Turkmenistan has an interesting role on the Nagorno-Karabakh issue. I mean, one of the justification was, oh, this was for solidarity for Azerbaijan, but the official position of Turkmenistan was actually of neutrality, of triangulation, but it seemed to be much more sympathetic with Yerevan rather than with Baku. So were these Armenians coming from Baku? Were these Armenians those refugees, or we'll say internally displaced, coming from Azerbaijan? I have no idea, and this is what I really wanted to investigate on, especially because I was trying to find any kind of evidence about this small trauma, about this episode, but the episode is that minimal that it was not easy to find in Turkmen sources about Armenians. But even Armenians at the time, I think that they had much more serious problems than discussing what was happening in terms of small violence in Turkmenistan. Anyway, I didn't find anything about that. So how this resentment was even perceived by these communities, and what was the real nature of these communities? Were they new settlers? Were those settlers coming from the late 19th century? What was the story, especially of the Nebit-Dag in Ashgabat? I mean, I think this much more institutionalized, this community. In Nebit-Dag, it's a matter that I still have to investigate, but unfortunately, I have no idea how to study a minority in an inaccessible republic. So I hope to have more occasions for this, but thank you. I realize it's a very important point.
About whether they were reacting or trying to respond in advance, let's say. The turning point is Nagorno-Karabakh for sure. It's in that moment that they decide about organizing the plenum. It's in that moment that they understand that they need not only a new elaboration of nationality policy, but also some more crisis manager figures. There is a need for structure, and that is also part of the answer to Alex. For example, there is the creation in 1990, but of this department for the prevention of conflicts. So this idea that you have to prevent, because you cannot repeat Nagorno-Karabakh, changes totally explains the readiness to find solutions. And of course, they are then mostly reacting, and also the plenum comes too late, and it's not a solution. But I would argue that the kind of the type of response that they find, even if it's a reaction, have an active dimension, and they're very much linked to the belief, especially of Gorbachev and others, that democratization is the way, and to try to solve nationalities. And in this sense, I go to Alex's question that, yes, since also democratization is seen as a return to the origin, it's true that the key debates, and I don't know what Nataliya, whether you saw it also in your sources, but it's more a deepening or a better description of the content of what was already there, a solution that were already made. But in terms of not only in a democratic context, but really to detail what that was meaning. I mean, all the discussion that I see are mostly on what do we mean now for nationalities and internationalism concretely. What does concretely mean this, and how can we translate it into decentralization reform? But then there are also interesting differences, I would say, among the bodies that were proposing reforms. And I found that maybe not surprisingly, but the Institute for Law of the Academy of Science was more progressive in many ways. They were, for example, since they were trying to find a legal solution to all that matter, there were some proposals of totally rebuilding the federation, trying to simplify, to create broader regions instead of just having all these territorial divisions. But then you have a lot of progressive thinkers, and I'm thinking about Galina Starovoitova, one of the most prominent, that on the contrary were for even more strengthening the rights of the minorities and nationalities. So this went against the possibility of reforming in the sense of less territorial entities, the union. And then as far as international solutions were searched, there are some references, not many, in the Russian Congress to other models of federation when they try to look at other solution. And I don't know what, I mean, I agree that on the territorial side, the solution were similar, since this idea of totally reforming the federation was really not so much supported. But I wonder whether this idea of protecting the minorities such, which is quite new in the debate, was already there, protecting also in terms of prevention of conflicts and all this institutional new network of bodies. It's,
Well, just quickly, what I came across is that not, well, first of all, I didn't come across, well, I didn't research on the minorities living in Ukraine. What I agreed that it was an attempt to revive rather than create something new. Yeah, and the language, yeah, it all came down to economy, because in the 20s, the whole argument was whether the republic should run their own economies. And this is what Ukraine tried to do in during Perestroika, and this is what Moscow didn't want in the 20s, and it didn't want in the 90s.
So if a lot of people were sort of chomping at the bit, so we do reach the stream now, right? And David and Mike here, and he comes back for the third one.
I have a question to you, Nataliya. So in regard that last year we commemorated 30 years of the collapse of the Soviet Union, and then the question seems still virulent also due to the book by about the collapse. So when did it happen, or when was the moment when people were beginning to think of that the Soviet Union could collapse? So I was asking myself when I heard you talk, when did they start here thinking that it is useless now to negotiate about having an autonomous economy, and when did they start thinking, if they didn't all the time, that it's better to now separate and go different ways? So if that is possible to define, and how.
Thanks. It's not so much a question, it's really a reflection on Carolina's paper. Thank you. I'm definitely going to go away and read some of your more recent work, but it reminded me a couple of years ago I published an article where I traced the process that led to the Estonian cultural autonomy law in 1993 from the late Soviet period through that transition. I was also struck by how, I think immediately after March 1990, when the Estonian Republic declared its start of the transition to independence, there was an immediate shift in the discourse from nationalities to minorities, and there was also this quite frequent reference to the need to plug into emerging international debates around minority rights. I'm thinking about the 1990 CSCE Charter of Paris, for instance. But what was also interesting was that when the law was first drafted, it was sent out to international expertise such as existed. It was also sent to Moscow and possibly, I can't remember, to the Institute of Law for, you know, for expertise and advice. It was also interesting that Moscow, in its dealings with Tallinn, was starting to use the discourse of minority rights. If you look at January 1991 and the interstate treaty, it's there. And then, I mean, you know, we can all see how minority rights were instrumentalized throughout nearly all the 1990s by Russia as it was trying to put pressure via OSCE, Council of Europe, etc. But yeah, but I also thought then about the more recent work I did in the 2010s when Federica and I were in Moscow and we made the cardinal error of talking about minorities and minority rights, and officials told us there are no minorities in Russia. We only have nationalities, and nationalities are equal. So as I say, that discourse had run into the sand, and you were back to the old, you know, discourse. But yeah, I just thought that is interesting how that kind of emerging international discourse was instrumentalized by various parties.
Thank you very much.
Oh, I have to, thank you. Just very. No, go ahead.
No, go on.
Oh, well, because I've got a quick question for you, so.
Okay, no, I'm listening, I'm all ears.
Just a very short point that, just about Cucciolla. Was this like his sort of late reinvention as was it convincing? Did it convince? I mean, or was it purely opportunism? Was he sort of tacking with the wind and going from the super pro-union guy to you know, to standing up for, you know, for the republics? And it seems to me perhaps, and I deal a bit with this with the National Communists, but like with reinvention and sort of rebranding oneself, because I think of his anti-national communism article in Communist in 1972, which was so forceful about like, and then here we are just 16 years later, and the tune is extremely different coming from him. So it's just that quick question. And then also to Riccardo, just a very little bit, and as you know, I'm absolutely delighted that you've come to here to talk to us about Turkmenistan. But I don't know, do you think that then without these clashes, without these ethnic clashes, and I know it is slightly counterfactual, but it's just curious as to, because you sort of say that this is the thing that gives them the excuse for the introduction of repressions. So without those clashes, is there the possibility of Perestroika in Turkmenistan? And no doubt, had there been, one would think there would have been some more, that post-Soviet Turkmenistan might not have been quite, this might not have been so easy to put the screws back in, you know, back on as happened. So thank you.
Analysts?
Okay, I'll go
No,
first.
answer these questions and then we'll take the next batch. I'm sorry.
Yeah,
No
thank you.
problem.
When it's better to separate, well, first of all, the Ukrainian Communist Party and even the Ukrainian politicum, they were not that keen to separate until it was no longer. It was forever until it was no more. Yeah, your check, thank you. But the kind of eyes-opening moment was in July '91, when Yeltsin forbade the oil producers, Russian oil producers, to supply oil to Ukraine, and it was this break of informal connections that suddenly Ukrainian producers, and again, we have to think of regions as coalitions of party state, and they all wanted to stay in power and all wanted to maintain access to the resources, and now private gains, so on and so forth. And suddenly they faced a real possibility that their enterprises would be deprived of fuel. We are talking also about the harvest coming up. And there was serious fear in the Ukrainian regions, all of them, because all the regions had agriculture, And they fear that here we are, Russia is cutting fuel. How can we respond? And they can't. What, they'll shut the seaports. There was a talk about that, but they didn't dare. And so this was, they've understood that they can be, that their access to power can be undermined because of Russia. And this is where they put very strong pressure on the Tsakaka. They're saying you have to consolidate the sovereignty, and to consolidate the sovereignty, it means to take control of our economy. And this talk, it is going in July 91, so early August, there is a huge meeting in the Tsakaka, and this is the point they're trying to push forward. So, well, and then Putsch, but really economic factor was very strong. As to Yomak's question, I think Sherbitsky conscientiously came to the document I quote. And the reason is Chernobyl. Because in '86, Sherbitsky was set up. The Republican leadership was traditional, that was its traditional function since the 20s. It was responsible for social well-being, for the population. So you have to feed the population. We don't care how that's coming from Moscow. And you have to take care of the security, so MVD, all the republics. And during Chernobyl, Sherbitsky was quite literally impotent to do absolutely anything to. But he had to face a backlash from the population, and that was very serious about relocation and feeding people and providing ecologically clean product. So to Sherbitsky, this whole, it was in '86, in April and May, when he comes to the realization that unless we formalize our relationship, why are they holding us responsible for what we have no resources to be responsible for? Do you see what I mean? And this, so Sherbitsky is very conscientious, but then he's, the regions are saying we need to decentralize further, and here where he could not make compromises. He couldn't. He was very top-down man, in a sense, very kind of the Soviet model administration. And
so, how would be Turkmenistan without these episodes? How would the story have been? Might change. I was pretty impressed by the fact that since the beginning and power of Niyazov, he introduced himself as a supporter of Perestroika, of reforms and things like that, but was kind of cosmetic attitude to reforms. We can see actually we can see something happening in Turkmenistan which can be parallel to what is happening in other republics, for example, also with Uzbekistan, but it's incomparable in terms of size, in terms of how this phenomenon actually mattered. So I see the possibility for a similar transition or a similar developments in as it happened in Uzbekistan. But in Uzbekistan, we had, for example, a weaker regimes. I mean, they are in the middle of a putsch season. In Turkmenistan, since 1985, I mean, Niyazov was able to get rid of all the Gapura group, and so all the Brezhnevian elite, and putting his own men. How things might change, I have no idea, but what is evident from what we have read from the party materials, and also for the KGB congratulating for the prevention of these anti-socialist forces, the prevention of other popular fronts that might take the example of the Balts. I don't know. In this case, we actually see that potentially the party gets has the perfect occasion to get rid of an opposition which, compared to the Uzbek one, is nothing. I mean, it's minimal. Is as I mentioned, is neither institutionalized, it's not registered, it's not recognized, but still it was developing. And at the same time, with this episode, he has the opportunity to nationalize the political discourse, as it happens in other republics. So we can see many similarities. Probably what the main change, the main difference with Uzbekistan is just in a matter of size, but also Fergana is something which represent a clear break with the openings of Perestroika and the openings also of the political discourse with glasnost, with all the possibilities of debating the things related to environment, to language, and all these discourses that since that moment start to be part of the official political discourse. So there is an appropriation of, so to many extents, I don't see so many differences with other republics. All republics are exploiting their own local incidents in order to strengthen a regime. Niazov just started before because he's in power since '85. The main difference that we might find with Karimov.
So we have 5 more people who want to ask questions. Group 2 and then the final 3. So Nikolai, and if a panelist wants to ask a question,
I might use my colleague research in Turkmenistan in the 1970s. So we talked a lot with people from the League and social society organization about the history. And so I understand why the Armenians, the Jewish person in this brilliant book describe how the Jewish and Armenians have a global concurrence and trade. And so for Central Asia, Armenians was the local Jews, because the local Jews was local. But Armenians were the Christian minority that come in the beginning of the 20th century and play a role of the agents of the imperialists, and support all imperial ideas, and also was very active in the trade, food supply, and so on. And so the Armenian mafia is not the walls, just the walls. And in the local level, of course, it was a lot of the conflicts between the different trade and food supply groups. For example, Azerbaijan groups or Tatar groups, or Uzbekistan huge food supply groups. And I suppose that's much true, which was against the Armenians. It was much disturbed against the new fighters from the Armenian side, which come like refugees to Armenians. It may be not really was, but the people who stay on the another side of the conflict between the trade mafias, Soviet trade mafias, think about. And so the pogroms was against the small businesses which Armenians organized. The same cases was in Tajikistan at the same time, or for example, Fergana Valley in 1989 also was pogroms against the Jewish, because the local Uzbekistan trade plants wanted to move the Jewish plants from some aspects of trade.
Thank you.
You started to answer the question by answering to Mike, but I was curious, since you studied so much Uzbekistan and what you were saying and telling, I mean, describing this crisis, it's something that could have changed a bit the course of Turkmen politics in these months, whether you saw fundamental differences also in reactions to protests, in the case of Uzbekistan to Fergana, or yes, the nature of the reactions, or deducing some differences.
There are some difference because I mean, at least in Uzbekistan, it's a matter, it starts to be a priority in the political discourse, the pacification. Or even Karimov itself is presented as a peacemaker in the republic. In Turkmenistan, it seems to be something more embarrassing. The regime. I mean, to prevent a reaction, people's reaction that the regime is not able to control. Maybe we cannot completely exclude that there can be even a role in the KGB, as even Roy writes, in managing some of these potentially explosive situations in order to get some results, but we have no evidence on that. The main difference is that in Uzbekistan is something that becomes more and more visible, the legacy of the Fergana in the construction of the regime. Here, what was interesting to me is that we can find that this reference. We don't have to repeat these episodes. We have to prevent these antisocial tensions as something that then will be associated to the oppositions. But we are talking about two completely different realities, which are just overlapped in order to get a political result, but something that I also should explore more.
Okay, final three. So four. Pietro, Joram, and maybe I don't have the last one.
Okay, yeah. So yeah, about minorities and discussing Carli might be relevant to the other papers and to David's point. And particularly interested, it's linked in your work to the sphere of migration, which you know, we talked about before. It's really interesting, a bit surprising. And I'm kind of, I mean, how do you make sense of that? Because if it's all about Nagorno-Karabakh, it doesn't quite make sense because, you know, people, Armenians are going to flee from Sultanate in Karabakh. Some of them could come to Moscow, some maybe to Ashgabat, but most of them are heading to Yerevan between months. So why should the RSFSR be afraid about that? It all makes sense to me if you when you remember, well, what's the biggest minority in the Soviet Union? It's the Russians, because there are millions of them in the non-Russian republics. And so just briefly to mention my kind of follow-up to Carolina's article in the same project, which is looking at the in terms of CIS and also bilateral treaties between Russia and other post-Soviet states in the 1990s, and it's very, very common, regular. You know, you might have a trade agreement between Russia and Tajikistan, and then there's a clause on the end about national minority rights, and it's Russia that's insisting on it being there. So in the Russian discourse in the early 90s, this is talking about minority rights, essentially talking about the Russians in the near abroad, and you know the one interesting one that there's this fear that, well, as we know, millions of them did return to Russia, but it could be even bigger numbers. And I think there seems to be a concern that, you know, protection of Russians in the near abroad is partly, but, you know, most of them will stay in the near abroad. But then there's another shift. So you know, from the Russian point of view, minorities means Russians in the near abroad in the 1990s. And then I didn't catch the date that David spoke about the, you know, when we've got no minorities in but at some point there's a shift from Russians abroad as a minority to Russians abroad as Nashi or our compatriots or something which is an altogether different kind of discourse, and it's part of suggested a bigger shift from a liberal discourse and you know, calling the Russians a minority, you know, it's universalizing them, and you know, means connecting to the CSCE and its other conventions and so on, to a very different discourse where it's the Russians are people, are compatriots, and are something special, and it's not universalized. This is, you know, I don't need to spell out some of the relevance of that to reason.
Oh yeah, I just wanted to say, first of all, you know, Nataliya, thank you very much. I mean, all of you, first, I just want to say all of you, not just Nataliya, but all of you have had wonderful presentations. And I love Turkmenistan. I mean, what you have done, Riccardo and Carolina, what you've done, excellent work. But my question is specifically directed toward Nataliya, which is, This issue about Ukraine, first of all, I want to thank you for bringing up this issue with the Russian Republic and the oil or the energy issue with Ukraine, because this is a very important, factor that, Yeltsin was thinking he was more independent of Russia. It also highlights and underscores the fact that it's the Russian Republic that actually spearheads in many ways the dissolution of the state in the end. But my actually, it's sort of a more of a comment than a question. I think your work highlights something very important, which is that we always talk about the relationship between the center and the republic. The center devolving more powers to the republic, but when we're dealing with a republic that has such diversity, that has so many oblasts that have different kind of economic needs, that have even different histories. Even if they're part of the same nation, they have kind of different, this kind of wide range of diversity. Often we don't look at that aspect of what maybe the central government, let's say Kiev, would be, how they would be dealing with other parts of, let's say, Ukraine. Because I think to me it's a very important case. And I guess my question would be, have you encountered, I know you're specialized more in Ukraine, but have you encountered analogous examples anywhere else in other republics of the Soviet Union? Because this is quite interesting. It's not really an issue about minorities, but an issue about diversity of the state.
So this is a question for Nataliya. There are a couple of, I think, very interesting moments in the paper. The first is when, this is for someone who doesn't know that much about the subject, but I'm kind of used to thinking about the power of these clans, Kharkov, Kursk, and so on. And you get this moment you describe where the OBCOM leaders, they write to Ashgabat, they're saying it's in your interest to decentralize. And that's a very, very interesting moment, and I think it's quite kind of unexpected. The other kind of moment, and this goes back to Susanna's question and to Mike's, and it's to do with Sherbitsky, because what you get occasionally in Soviet political history are moments when very, very experienced politicians behave in ways that you really don't expect them to behave. And you need to make sense of why that is. So Sherbitsky is, he's untouchable, and he knows how this system works. And so the question is, why does he do this? Why do you have this kind of flip? And I think you need to think in a way about the signals, the cues that he's responding to, because he understands how the system works really, really very, very well. I mean, it's kind of woven into this, like, the fabric of his being. So there's something that's going on that is really radically changing the way he's kind of thinking about everything. And you mentioned Chernobyl, but the thing that I'm kind of wondering about is there may be other things, and there may be, I'm not just talking about kind of a temporal development, but there may be kind of processes, and in particular there's the sort of economic and political. So I'd just like to reflect a little bit on that. So there's a political shift from the party to the Soviets, and the economic, at some level, there's something going on which is quite fundamental. And that might be to do with this tension which you described at the very beginning between, on the one hand, fulfilling the plan, on the other hand, making sure that you meet the socio-economic demands of the country.
5 minutes left. If you could state your question, then I'll let you guys respond to it.
My question is to Nataliya. What was a role of military industrial complex in those overgains during Perestroika, between the regions, Kiev and Moscow?
Thank you very much. You have 5 minutes more now to answer all the questions. No question.
We just answer. I think I just have Jeremy's comment, and yes, First, it's sure that there is an instrumentalization of the issue of minorities, to respond to what it was saying, and I still don't get to what extent in these early 90s in these documents of the ministry they believe in this risk of massive arrivals. Not only, you're right, from conflict zone and regions, but also of Russians, basically. There is this fear for sure, but I don't know whether in this internal communication documents they're exaggerating already at this stage the risk, because they want these communities to stay where they are. And this is something that I could find wrote by Tishkov in a later document quite clearly, no, not clear, very clearly, that we need the communities to stay there because we have to continue to have an influence on them. So they formalize it in a document. And then the shift you were saying about this conception of compatriots is already evident in this last draft of 1991 I was talking about, where there is this new and broader definition of minorities. They still don't know how to define the different minorities, but of course the reference is to Russian. But there is also a last article on the need to protect communities, large communities of Russians outside. So this is a problem that 1 month before the end of the Soviet Union comes already. Gosh, I had other points, but I don't. No, yes, and the last is that in the discourse, this idea of minorities does not pass because it's considered as a downgrade of the population, of being considered a minority. So what's you were saying before.
Thank you for the questions. So, Peter, very quickly about analogous examples, very short, no. Well, there are no analogous studies. As you could see from my work on Samnarkhozy, if you looked at it, I struggle with the same. How do I compare the Samnarkhozy in Ukraine to other republics? All I could see is how many were created. Okay, fine, let's compare to Kazakhstan. But then I need to look at the allocation of production forces in Kazakhstan by you see where I'm going, right? So no, sorry. Regarding the power of clans, yes, definitely. Their whole point was, to put it very kind of grosso modo, Moscow is failing us. Moscow fails to provide resources. Resources was everything, even to the obcom secretaries. And this is why they were saying we are all still communists, kind of, sort of. And you have to take the lead. You just have to take the lead. And this kind of reflects on your answers a bit to your second question, why does he flip? Sherbitsky under incredible pressure since '86. And so no security from Moscow for resources, no guidance as to how win elections. The Western, I'll give you just one evidence, the Western, so obkomy who were losing in the elections to the Soviets in the Western Oblasti, they united themselves, so they gathered for a union in Ivano-Frankivsk. It was beginning of '89, January, and they didn't even invite the ЦК. So and then in '88, in autumn, there is a plenum and they are discussing, they're saying to the deputies, not deputies, obcom secretaries from Eastern Oblasti taking the floor, and they're saying, let's collect money for the obcom in Western Oblasti. They're being crucified there by Rukh. And Sherbitsky, and they're not asking Sherbitsky, they're not saying Sherbitsky, you have to organize. No, they said, okay, let's do something. And they address them directly to the obcom in Chernivtsi, and they're saying, give us your bank account, so to speak, and we'll send you money. So yes, and he was under this pressure, political, and in Zaporizhia, there was a forum of Rukh and the Ukrainian leadership, the Ukrainian Ministry of, I don't remember what, he provided fuel to the buses that brought Rukh delegates from all over Ukraine to Zaporizhia. And the obcom secretary of Zaporizhia, of all places, neighbor to Dnipropetrovsk, is asking, what are you doing? First of all, you haven't asked me whether I'm ready to host them. You haven't provided us with fuel to water the streets. It's hot, it's summer. So the pressure is very strong, and it was building up. And Ruch, of course, was a huge, they largely overestimated. In fact, Ruch was one of the reasons why Sherbitsky did not want to decentralize economic administration, because he was saying that right now I'm kind of holding resources, and if we officially decentralize and then Ruch takes over these regions through election, they will be in control of those resources, and this I will not let happen. On the military complex, I did not look at the specifically military complex, but considering that obcom secretaries of these oblasts like Kharkiv and Dnipropetrovsk would be speaking for the military complex, they face the same problems. The same problems. Moscow was failing them in all possible respects. No political guidance, no resources, no security. They didn't feel secure. And they too pressured Kiev to consolidate the Ukrainian center. And as you know, Donbass was strongly in favor of Ukrainian independence exactly because of the economic failures. The Crimea was strongly in favor of Ukrainian independence because Russia was failing them with resources, and they wanted badly to stay in power. Thank you very much for your questions.
We can continue the conversation.
It's coffee time.
Yes. Please join me.